טוב, השעה 10, אז אני מרשה לעצמי להתחיל. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. It is both an honor and a privilege to chair this panel, Fragile Balances, Israel and the Middle East, as part of the broader conversation on shades of democracy and authoritarianism, historical and contemporary perspectives. Our region, the Middle East, embodies the complex tensions between democratic aspirations and authoritarian persistence, where the path to political transformation is marked by both remarkable resilience and profound challenges. It is a region defined by paradoxes, where visions of progress and liberty coexist with deeply rooted challenges of conflict, inequality, and oppression. These dynamics are not confined to any one state or society. They are interconnected, reverberating across borders and shaping the shared destinies of millions. The title of our panel, Fragile Balances, is itself a reflection of the delicate and sometimes precarious equilibrium that defines the Middle East, whether we are discussing questions of national identity, the pursuit of self-determination, or the aftermath of revolutionary movements. One thing remains clear. This is a region where every step towards democracy must contend with the weight of history and the forces of resistance to change. Today, as we gather here in Israel during a time of war and profound internal challenge to our democratic foundations, these discussions take on heightened significance. Our three presenters will examine different phases of these complex dynamics, the unique characteristics and challenges of Jewish democracy, the transformative impact of the Arab Spring and its aftermath, and the Palestinian struggle within competing political frameworks. The questions we explore today are not merely theoretical, they are lived experience that shape our present reality and our future possibilities. I invite all of us to engage in these discussions with both scholarly insight and an appreciation for the gravity of our current moment. Through this dialogue, we hope to better understand not only the challenge facing democracy in our region, but also the pathways towards resilience and renewal. Our first presenter is Professor Ron Margolin, who teaches at the Department of Jewish Philosophy and the MA program in Religious Studies at Tel Aviv University. He's a researcher of modern Jewish thought, including the philosophy of Martin Buber and Hans Jonas, Jewish mysticism, especially Hasidism, general religiosity, and secularism, and secular Jewish and humanistic education in Israel. Among his main important publications are the monographs, The Human Temple, Religious Interiorization, and the Structuring of Inner Life in Early Hasidism by Magnus Press, Jerusalem, and the English version will be published soon as well. Another monograph is The Inner Religion in Jewish Sources, published by Academic Studies Press in Boston, 2021. His last project, the editing of New Hebrew book, Martin Buber, through contemporary eyes, research and reflections on the centennial of I and Thou, will be printed by Carnell and Yediot Acharonot in the beginning of 2025. His lecture today will be on the topic of what is a Jewish democracy. Professor Margolin, the floor is yours. Thank you.
During the past month, as in the past few years, we have witnessed in Israel and throughout the world how ostensibly strong democracies can fall, as in the 20th century, into the familiar trap perpetually lurking in every democracy. I refer here to the reduction of democracy into a formalism that defines it as no more than a system committed to representing the people through majority rule, without any commitment by the majority and its leaders to safeguarding all citizens based on justice and equity protecting human life and every citizen's basic rights. Proponents of the formalistic approach assume that representing the people through majority decision is the only agreed binding value. The opposing position views democracy as a mechanism for maximum protection of the entire public, yet also of each and every individual, not just against the external dangers which threaten the state, but also against harm to minority groups and individuals. The position's core is safeguarding citizens against the caprices of the powerful, particularly of the rulers. Hans Kelsen, the renowned legal scholar who is often quoted in support of the later position, summarizes this as follows, and you can read with me. He who only relies on earthly truth and only allows human knowledge to direct social policy can justify the coercion which the realization of that policy can inevitably require in no other way than with the assent of at least the majority of those who are supposed to benefit from the coercive order. Furthermore, because the minority is not absolutely wrong, the coercive order must be constructed in such a way that the minority will not be rendered entirely without rights and itself can become the majority at any time. This is the actual meaning of the system we call democracy. Kelsen, who formed this philosophy between the two world wars, attempted to square the circle and prove how the principle of democratic majority inherently includes protection against the tyranny of the majority or of the ruler reigning by majority rule. He asserted that any democratic majority must consider the minority's opinion, as it must be aware that the tables could quickly be turned and any majority could become a minority. This assumption has been debunked again and again since Kelsen wrote his book. Furthermore, in his book itself, he mentions values that are indispensable to education for democracy, without which democracies could become no more than formal systems. Today, in many places, the majority's tendency to disregard its own transience is again palpable. When a majority with a formalistic understanding of democracy loses, it refuses to accept the change and continues to perceive itself as the majority even after the loss. Furthermore, in a democracy, awareness of the constant possibility of majority becoming minority does not apply to ethnic minorities, which are more than political groups like Israel's Arab citizens or LGBTQ, and we heard a lot of examples yesterday evening in the keynote. This lecture's first underlying assumption is that one cannot rely on the principle of relative majority as the sole safeguard for minority rights. Rather, democracy must include additional binding values to fulfill its purpose. The claim that in a secular world it is impossible to unify around binding absolute values beyond the majority principle is incorrect. Modern philosophy has proposed impressive ways to validate basic moral values that can replace the arbitrary, indisputable divine commandment. When modern legislators rely on moral principles, they are doubtlessly leaning on these attempts without admitting it. For example, the most famous example, Immanuel Kant's categorical imperative coalesces into the conclusion that no person is never just a means, but rather an end in itself. This is an important, yet not singular, secular attempt to formulate a non-religious version of absolute humanistic religious commandments, such as "Thou shalt not kill," or "Love thy neighbor as thyself." This is a way to preserve the content and to validate a moral value whose absoluteness is grounded, according to religious tradition, in being the word of God, and to replace it with rational, non-mythical, and therefore secular language. As I will soon explain, I propose replacing the concept Jewish and democratic state, first included in the Knesset legislation in 1992, with the concept Jewish democracy. This version is intended to protect Israel's classification as a democracy committed to moral values. It seeks to protect all citizens from tyranny and the majority by conditioning the majority principle on a limited, predefined number of principles which can be attributed to Jewish sources. These principles can provide a direct infrastructure for safeguarding the people from tyranny and preventing the majority from trampling minorities and individuals. There have been countless debates about the substance of a Jewish and democratic state. Despite myriad attempts, the overall impression is that whenever there was a need to agree on the essence of this concept, many felt it was a paradox. Therefore, many assumed the term was no more than a compromise between religious and secular conceptions of the state's Jewishness. Among the religious public, many understand the concept of a Jewish state ideally as a state governed by the rules of the Jewish law, halakha. These rules derive their original authority from an absolute, divine source, which is independent from the will of the people. From this source, through a chain of transmission from generation to generation, extends the authority of the rabbis entrusted with interpreting and expanding this law. The rabbis themselves derive their authority from their studies, and they do not represent the people, rather a certain sacred tradition within the people. This principle is diametrically opposed to democracy's fundamental idea, the sovereignty of the people, which confers on its representatives the authority to enact laws. Consequently, the people's representatives are also authorized to amend and initiate laws without limit. Many Israelis are unaware that all religious legislation in Israel, such as marriage and divorce by religious rather than civil tribunals, are the fruit of parliamentary decisions under the principle of majority representation and are not derived from those laws' divine heteronomous origin. All these laws were enacted through a non-religious majority vote, and by force of this majority, they exercise religious coercion on the public. Thus, there is an unbridgeable gap between the democratic and halachic system. Separation of church and state, the European concept at the root of modern secularism, first enabled equal rights for the Jewish minority. Remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt. From this instruction, Hillel the elder learned that which is hateful to you, do not do unto others. Therefore, this is the whole Torah. And then go and learn. In their own state, Jews must remember the hardships of minorities and foreigners. Therefore, it is the spirit of the Torah that dictates that upon returning to their land to establish a state, the Jewish people must adopt a democratic system that guarantees both through its secularism and its humanistic Torah values, Jewish morality. More than the halachic system which took shape when the Jews did not have a state, the democratic system, which is founded on legislative representation of all citizens, makes it possible to uphold Hillel's words. In addition to justifying democracy through the fundamental principle of Hillel, I would like to propose at least 4 more principles from the Bible and/or rabbinic literature, without which no democracy can defend itself from formalist reductionism. Sometimes in life, great ideas come from an exceptional inspiration of great individuals' mind that might have been called divine inspiration in ancient times. But the adoption of these traditional Jewish principles in Israel as democracy based on intellectual and intuitive arguments. 1. The idea that God created mankind in his own image as a metaphor that expresses the principle of equality for the all human life and recognition of the principle of the inner purpose of every individual's life. The biblical creation story has no scientific value, But the story's importance is its clear moral dimension, which seeks to emphasize the argument that no person's blood is redder than another's. A well-known example from the tractate Sanhedrin clarifies how the sages of the Mishnah understood the story, and I want to read with you the second source here. And this serves to tell of the greatness of the Holy One, blessed be He, as when a person stamps several coins with one seal, they are all similar to each other. But the Supreme King of Kings, the Holy One, blessed be He, stamped all people with the seal of Adam, the first man, as all of them are his offspring, and not one of them is similar to another. Therefore, since all humanity descends from one person, each and every person is obligated to say, the world was created for me. Many interpretations have been written about this statement, but without a doubt, its objective is to impart that every person is unique, while at the same time everyone shares a basic mold which generates equality through difference. The seemingly misunderstood expression, the world was created for me, which could be interpreted as a justification for egocentrism, was articulated by Kant in his injunction to treat every human being as an end in itself. The Mishnah coin metaphor incorporates Kant's logical conclusion and necessitates a series of absolute prohibitions against immoral acts that disregard this commandment. If all humans were created in the same mold, the laws they enact should also apply to everyone equally. 2. The law of kings. Democracy demands term limits for important office holders, first and foremost the Prime Minister. In Deuteronomy it is said, "You shall be free to set a king over yourself, and he shall not have many wives, lest his heart go astray, nor shall he amass silver and gold to excess. Thus he will not haughtily toward his fellows or deviate from the instruction to the right or to the left." In contrast to fundamentalists today in Israel, Rabbi Naftali Tzvi Yehuda of Volozhin stipulated in his interpretation of these verses that the commandment to set a king does not impose monarchical rule on a people that does not desire monarchy. The system of government is the foundation of societal life, and therefore it should not be imposed upon society, not even in the name of religious commandments. The biblical law of kings certainly indicate an awareness of the narcissistic dangers the people face at the hands of its rulers. Even those elected democratically can fall in love with power and dictatorship. The spirit of Judaism, which stipulates equality for all before the law, demands restraining the ruler from alienation and haughtiness toward the people. A Jewish democratic state must legislate limitations on the terms of elected officials, above all the prime minister, to 2 terms, as accepted in most democracies in the world, including the United States. Clearly, in Israel, which still does not limit the prime minister's term, a Jewish democracy does not yet exist. 3. In Exodus it is said, "Thou shalt not follow a multitude to do evil, neither shalt thou speak in a cause to incline after a multitude to prefer justice." Restricting the majority principle according to the principles of justice and equity. These verses' meaning has been narrowed in rabbinic interpretations to specific situations of majority decisions in rabbinic tribunals, but in today's democracies, it is clearer than ever that the verses' straightforward meaning demands limiting majority decisions that could wrong or inflict injustice upon communities or individuals. An intuitive reading of this verse reflects an awareness of the dangers posed by majority votes that could trample justice for individuals or groups. Democracy cannot be moral unless it is committed to preventing the infringement of the fundamental human rights of minorities and individuals, and unless it allows a third party, such as the court, to review important decisions by the legislature and the regime. through the lens of justice and equity. For our sages, an obligation to refrain from cruelty toward the poor and the weak and to aid them in times of distress can be derived from the biblical word tzedakah, which comes from the same root as tzedek, justice. This special link between the principle of justice and the obligation to support and refrain from cruelty toward the poor, and to have mercy upon them, as stated by Maimonides in the Mishneh Torah, sets as infrastructure for what today is called social justice. 4. And last, Torah study. There is no greater guarantee for democracy than continuous education for its basic values. According to our sages' utterance, great is Torah study for its leads to action. The centrality of study in Jewish rabbinical culture is well known, but its cultural importance stems from its perception as an impetus for involvement and practical implementation of the Torah's values and the rules. In a Jewish democracy, this principle would be adopted in the spirit of Kelsen's words in his chapter on the people. There, he stipulated in depth continuous education of the people as a precondition for material democracy, and not formal democracy, to motivate the people to participate in the democratic process. Maintaining the democracy's commitment to the values of justice, equity, protecting individual and minority rights, and realizing these Jewish principles I have described above requires constant study and debate. Conclusion. In Jewish sources, a place of honor is reserved for some basic values that should anchor democracy, preventing it from becoming a sword in the hands of anti-democratic causes that are not committed to safeguarding citizens. Undoubtedly, the principles taken here from Jewish sources are selective. The Bible itself is a text created in the archaic world of the Near East, where tribal affiliation molded individual consciousness, and individuals did not distinguish themselves from this affiliation. The development of modern individualism and the modern concept of the citizen released the individual from complete dependence on the group to a great extent. This is the main reason to the tensions between traditional societies and more liberal societies all over the world. It is therefore impossible to reconcile democratic and religious systems, not only because of the source of authority, but also because of the tension between the individual and the group, which intensifies when the later type of system is in practice. Despite this, adopting the basic commitment to integrity and justice in Jewish religious sources can bolster the moral dimension absent in basic democracies, which have no binding principle beyond representation of all citizens through the majority. Reality in Israel may be farther from this vision than ever, but one might say the verse, "For lack of vision, a people lose restraint." This was written to describe Israel's secular camp's take on the Jewishness of Israel democracy. In Israel's case, without an alternative of non-orthodox vision to the existing reality, which can preserve democracy and reinforce its values by relying on Jewish sources which have the power to do so, I fear that Israeli society will simply fall apart. Thank you.
That was 20 seconds before time, so this is impressive. Okay, our next speaker is Professor Elie Podeh. He's a Bamberger and Flood Professor in History of the Muslim Peoples in the Department of Islamic and Middle East Studies at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. His main expertise is the modern Middle East. In particular, he specializes in Egypt, inter-Arab relations, Arab-Israeli relations, and Israel and the Middle East. He served as the department chair during the years 2004-2009 and president of the Middle East and Islamic Studies Association of Israel during the years 2016-2022. Since 2011, he is a board member of Mitvim, the Israel Institute for Regional Foreign Policies. He has published and edited 16 books and more than 80 articles in English, Hebrew, and Arabic. Wow, okay? And his recent book publications, Chances for Peace, Missed Opportunities in the Arab-Israeli Conflict by Austin University Press of Texas, 2016, and Israel's Secret Relations with the States and Minorities in the Middle East, 1948 to 2020, in Hebrew by Amoved, 2022, and is forthcoming by Indiana University Press in English. So, Professor Podeh, the floor is yours.
לא, את האור פה אולי. האור שמה בסדר.
בסדר?
רגע, שנייה, איך אני מעביר? איפה לא, בסדר. בסדר? Okay, good morning everyone, and thank you all for coming, and thank you for inviting me to this important conference. Okay, are we finished? Okay, so I'm going to talk about the fate of democracy in the Middle East in general, covering many countries, excluding, of course, Israel, because two of the distinguished lecturers here in this panel, they are talking about Israel and Jewish democracy and so on. You can see here a picture of Mohammed Bouazizi, the guy who set himself on fire in Tunisia and in many ways ignited the Arab Spring in 2010, and later on it went in different Arab countries in different phases lasted for something like a decade. So it's quite a long period. However, I mean, we are in 2024. Anyone here still remembers something called like the Arab Spring? Looks like a long time ago. Anyway, I was trying to capture the essence of what is going on in, maybe if it's possible, not always it is possible, in one word, and I came up with Demokratura. Which is, of course, a combination of democracy and it is dictatorship. It stands better in Hebrew, of course. Demokratia ודיקטטורה, and then Demokratura. But I was surprised to find out that I didn't invent really the term. I mean, it was already on the internet. And actually, you can see here, it was invented already in 1965 by a Swedish writer, but the idea was not very much developed academically. So this might be an interesting term to work with. Anyway, the aim of the terms is saying something about the survival of the political elite while convincing its people and the world that this type of regime enjoys the legitimacy of the people. Now, I'm sure that you find that this is not very unique to the Middle East. I mean, we can find it in many places around the world, especially these days. But we are going to concentrate on the Middle East. Let's start with some data, which I think is very important and illuminating. I hope you can see that. This is an index very much used by scholars of Freedom House Index for 2024. And these are the countries of the Middle East. So you could see that among the most unfree countries in the world are from the Middle East. The first one, South Sudan, and then Sudan. You know, these are two separate countries. Somalia, Gaza, and Saudi Arabia, and Libya, and Yemen. These are, we're talking about 7 countries in the first 10. If you go to the second 10 countries, then you find Iran, Bahrain, Egypt, UAE, West Bank, Oman, Qatar, Iraq, Algeria, and so on. So Israel is in the place of 74. The one which gets higher points is, of course, Tunisia, and I'll talk about Tunisia later on because this is a very unique and important example. But it means that as far as the data goes, you could see where the countries, most of the countries in the Middle East, where they are placed. And secondly, you can't really see it, I guess, so you'll have to count on my word, but I will say the following. You see, these are the changes in the last 10 years worldwide. So among the major changes that occurred, Libya is down 32 places, Turkey 27, Yemen 16, Egypt 13, and Tunisia 12. So we are seeing a process of retreat in terms of democracy. So on the one hand, there were some important changes, but at the same time, we see now a big and decisive retreat. These are the deposed rulers during the Arab Spring. I'm sure that at least the names or the countries you are familiar with, but you could see Egypt, Tunisia, Libya, Yemen, Sudan, Algeria, in different phases, by the way. We are not talking about one phase. There were at least 2 or 3 phases during this decade. The second one was during 2019, mainly in Sudan, in Algeria, in Morocco, and Iraq. But I guess that we are most familiar with the first wave that occurred at the beginning with toppling Mubarak, Zain Abdin Ben Ali in Tunisia, Muammar Gaddafi in Libya, and Yemen. And Syria, there was, to some extent, still an uprising against Bashar al-Assad, but he survived. Some shuddering myths about the Arab Spring. It was a very important moment in the Arab world, first of all for the intellectuals, but not only for them, for the people in general, because for them it was a kind of a proof that whatever you said, you, the West, about us, the Middle East, the Arabs, you proved wrong. And these were some of the myths that were shattered. First, refuting the Western thesis of Arab and Muslim exceptionalism. The West in general used to exceptionalize the Middle East, Islam in general. They are different because of their legacy, because of their religion, because of history, and so on. Secondly, this is what we witness in the Arab world is the fourth wave of democracy, imitating the Spring of Nations in Europe in the 19th century, and the third wave of democracy in Eastern Europe, following the disintegration of the Soviet Union. And that's how came the term Arab Spring, going back to the Spring of Nations in the 19th century. And another very common term was the Second Arab Awakening, which then suggested or ignited an argument, okay, so what was the first awakening? And here there was some debate, because some said that the first one was before and after World War I, with the rise of Arab nationalism and the establishment of the Arab states following the disintegration of the Ottoman Empire. Others said Nasserism, the rise of Gamal Abdel Nasser and his ideas about the establishment of an Arab state, social justice, and so on. And me and my friend, colleague of mine, on Winkler, we published a collection of articles on the Arab Spring, and we used the term the third wave. So actually what we have done is that we acknowledge the fact that there was the first one, as I mentioned before, the second one, which was Nasserism, and what we witnessed, the Arab Spring, is in fact the third Arab wave. And in contrast to the other waves, now the target mainly is to change the government, but also to erect a democracy, which was not part of the revolutions and the changes in the second and not in the first one, not necessarily, let's say, okay? But that was one of the essences of the Arab Spring was the building of democracy. Next, the rise of the people, and here intellectuals talk about the invisible Arab. You, the West, you didn't recognize us, you didn't see us at all. I mean, we the people, we went out into the streets and we played a very major role in those revolutions. The end of post-colonialism in the Arab world, because the first wave was, the first or the second, depends on your argument, was intended in order to end colonialism. But then we are talking about the beginning of the post-colonial period with its own features. Now that is the end of it. And then started the debate. I mean, was there really a revolution? Was it only an uprising, which eventually even failed? And that question has been, I think, answered, and you'll see in a minute in what way. Okay, so here you have a few pictures of those rulers. In Egypt, you could see the one who was deposed, then Morsi, who was democratically elected in Egypt. And that was for the first time that Egypt underwent a fully democratic election, which is complete contrast to what happened before and what happened afterwards, because elections are still being held. But at that time, that was the first democratic elections. And eventually it ended with a coup, a military coup. There's no other word to describe it, by Abdel Fattah al-Sisi in 2013. And since then, Egypt more or less returned to the place it had been during the Mubarak, and even worse. So that is the situation in Tunisia, starting with Zain Al Ben Ali. In the middle, you see here a very interesting phase in Tunisia. That was in 2015, when what is called the Quartet. The Quartet is an amalgamation of four civil society associations in Tunisia. The labor, human rights organization, and so on. And they collided, they united in order to help and bring democracy. They played such a noble role that they actually won the Nobel Peace Prize in Stockholm in 2015. And that experiment ended with Kais Saied in 2019, with the return, more or less, of autocracy to Tunisia. That is in the beginning, okay. You know, he established Tunisia. Okay? Yes, okay. But we didn't talk about Tunisia's specific history. Okay, let's move ahead. Libya, starting with Muammar Gaddafi. Again, you can go back to King Idris, right? I mean, this is not a lesson in history, sorry, and I apologize. So Muammar Gaddafi, he was deposed, and instead, Libya underwent also a democratic process, at least at the beginning. However, it ended with Libya, to a large extent, divided into two. One government in the capital of Tripoli, headed by this guy, the prime minister, and in contrast, you have a General Haftar, who is in Benghazi, the other side, the eastern side of Libya. So Libya as well is still in a situation of a kind of a civil war, but nevertheless far, far away from democracy. Most of their monarchies, they remain more or less stable. You could see Jordan, Morocco, Saudi Arabia, Oman, Bahrain, United Arab Emirates. All of them, most of them, they took some reforms in order to struggle against the possible uprising of the population. All of them succeeded very well. And that's also raised a very interesting question: were the monarchies and the monarchs better suited to deal with the uprising? The way they dealt with them was better than the Republicans, than the presidents? Obviously, yes, if you judge according to the outcome. Popular explanation for democracy deficiency in the word. What I'm going to do here is to offer a few explanations suggested by the scholars dealing with the subject. The first one is the incompatibility between Islam and democracy. And here it is taken from Elie, a renowned professor in Middle Eastern Studies, taught many years in the LSE in London, and he said the following: the notion of popular sovereignty as the foundation of governmental legitimacy, the idea of representation or elections, of popular suffrage, of political institutions being regulated by laws laid down by a parliamentary assembly, of these laws being guarded and upheld by an independent judiciary, the ideas of the secularity of the state, of society being composed of a multitude of self-activating groups and associations. Yes, a very long sentence. All these are profoundly alien to the Muslim political tradition. Very clear. You could say in general that Bernard Lewis, although he is more nuanced, and Samuel Martin Lipset is a Western, very important intellectuals, they more or less the same ideas. Similar ideas connected Arab or Islamic exceptionalism, as I said before, absence of tolerance, and so on. Against this very idea, it was said as, this is only one quotation obviously, but it represents a school of thought among Middle Eastern scholars. Democratization need not be simply the adoption of Western democratic forms or the formulation of indigenously rooted forms of political participation and empowerment. Western democracy is also the product of reinterpretation or reformulations of older concepts, beliefs, and institutions, opens up the possibility of other cultural and religious traditions, generating and accommodating democratic forms of government. Esposito and Fall, Islam and democracy. So they are saying something completely different. They are, to some extent, I think they are repeating the very famous notion of the sociologist Eisenstadt, who talked about multiple modernities, saying there is no one modernity, the one that was invented or brought from the West, but there are many ways. And one of them, or many of them, or others are located elsewhere, and it might be a combination, combination of Western and Eastern concept and thoughts and culture and so on. So that sounds very logical, and it is a very plausible explanation. Now look at it. When they went into, when they went into the can't be, what we have, 15 or 20 minutes?
20.
20?
And you have like 3.5.
Okay. So I'll run. Some of them are rooted of the ideas rooted in Islamic thought, like Shura. Shura means consultation. So, okay, fine. So, I mean, democracy and consultation goes hand in hand. Ijtihad, it's independent sovereign reasoning, so it's like, freedom and so on. All right, let me just move ahead. Failure of democratic governments and autocrat success. So to summarize, you can read that, but it means that in reality, on the ground, the autocrats were very successful. And the democratic regimes, all of them failed. Look at what happened in Egypt. I mean, in terms of delivering what they promised. If we go back to Arab history, then we see that the colonialism to a large extent was associated with democracy. And this democracy failed in Iraq, and in Lebanon, and in Syria, and in Egypt. In all these countries, there was a semblance of democracy. All of them failed. So it didn't have good reputation. And the third explanation is the legacy of colonialism, which maybe I don't have to explain, which is very well known. Tunisia is a very good example because most of the expectations were, well, at least if Tunisia will succeed, it will be the lighting rod. It will be the example that one day will be followed by other countries, but it didn't happen. I don't have the time to go into the details of specifically what happened in Tunisia, but the sad results are that since 2019, Tunisia, to a large extent, went back to its place during Ben Ali. So let me conclude with that. So what happened with the rise of Demokratura? None of the Arab countries in the post-Arab Spring era has a democratic regime. This is a fact of life. Islamic countries do not fare well as well, and even in the most celebrated example, Indonesia, which is 57 in the index mentioned before, we can see a significant decline following the last elections, which happened this year. It is difficult to indicate one factor leading to lack of democracy and proliferation of autocratic regimes, given their number. A good start is a combination of the reasons explained above and the local historical record and social composition. In search of legitimacy, autocrats employ various political tools, such as elections, parliament, parties, constitutions, court of justice, yet these are exercises in democratic theater, and hence Demokratura. And some of them, many of them, they see China as a model. I mean, this is something that they are talking about, that China should be or can be a model. And let me conclude with trying somehow, not to predict, but to say at least, to quote Monsef Marzouki, a very important, interesting figure. He is an intellectual and previous Tunisian president during the year 1114. And he was asked about democracy. His answer was, has our faith for democracy being lost? He asked. The answer is yes. But this defeat is temporary. Let's hope he is right. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for Professor Podeh. And our third speaker is Dr. Assaf David. He's the director of the Israel in the Middle East Department at the Leer Jerusalem Institute and co-founder and academic director of the Forum of Regional Thinking. He teaches comparative politics of the Middle East at the Department of Political Science at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. His topics of interest include Jordan, civil-military relations in the Middle East, Arab public discourse, Israel's place in the Middle East, and the Middle East as an academic discipline in Israel. And his topic today is Israel and Palestine, a joint struggle against autocracy and theocracy. Dr. Assaf David, the floor is yours.
Can I have the light, please? Because I have to read. Good morning. Thank you for inviting me to share with you my thoughts on the necessity of a joint struggle against autocracy and theocracy in Israel and Palestine. Israel is a parliamentary democracy with a multi-party system and independent institutions that guarantee political rights and civil liberties for most of the population. Although the judiciary is comparatively active in protecting minority rights, the political leadership and many in society have discriminated against Arab and other ethnic or religious minority populations, resulting in systemic disparities in areas including infrastructure, criminal justice, education, and economic opportunity. Israel's score and status do not reflect conditions in the Gaza Strip or in the West Bank, which are both rated not free and are examined in separate reports. This is the overview of Israel by the Freedom House, mentioned also by Elie, an internationally renowned organization that monitors political rights and civil liberties globally. While it rates Israel as a free country, the text speaks volumes. The vague reference to most of the population fails to identify the mysterious minority groups whose rights and liberties are not necessarily guaranteed. I will discuss this issue first and return later to the non-free population of Gaza and the West Bank. Asking for a definition of a political regime from scholars and intellectuals is usually what we do in academia. Asking for a definition of a political regime from scholars and intellectuals is usually what we do in academia. However, as we know, a chain is only as strong as its weakest link, and the weakest links of any given system provide valuable inside information. Perhaps we should turn to Israel's weakest link, then, for an informed evaluation of the country's nature. Israel, by its own definition, is a Jewish and democratic country, and therefore its weakest links are Arab Palestinian citizens. Ahmad Tibi, a seasoned member of Knesset, admits indeed that Israel is Jewish and democratic, Jewish for Arabs and democratic for Jews. In recent years, one might add, Israel has become even more Jewish and less democratic for both its Jewish and Arab citizens, but the weakest links feel the change and fear it more than the stronger links. While Israeli Jews enjoy both citizenship and nationality, Israeli Arabs enjoy only citizenship but are excluded from Israeli nationality. In fact, there is no Israeli nationality. Israel's Supreme Court, presumably the champion of liberal values, has consistently rejected the concept of an Israeli nationality as distinct from citizenship. In a landmark decision in October 2013, it denied a request to recognize Israeli as a nationality, asserting that while all citizens are classified as Israeli for citizenship, their nationality is defined by ethnic and religious groups. It also reaffirmed a previous decision which held that there was no evidence of an Israeli nationality formed separately from Jewish nationality. Those who failed to understand the meaning of this division of labor between citizenship and nationality in Israel were giving a strong answer 5 years later. The nation-state law enacted by the Knesset in July 2018 establishes Israel as a nation-state for the Jewish people. By emphasizing only the Jewish right to self-determination and promoting Jewish settlements as a national value, it legitimized discrimination against Palestinians. In July 2021, the Supreme Court ruled that the nation-state law was constitutional and did not negate the state's democratic nature. Zionists perceive Israel as a democratic country. Center left-wing supporters would argue that Israel is a democracy going astray, although they will reject the superiority of its democratic nature over its Jewish nature in case of a fundamental clash between them. Right-wing supporters, on the other hand, adopt a majoritarian interpretation of democracy. As put candidly by Minister Miri Regev, there are many democratic states in the world, but only one Jewish state. According to this popular view, not only Jewish supremacy trumps democratic values, but even the Zionist left is a looming danger. A Jewish nation-state entails, inter alia, a religious and exclusionary interpretation of the word Jewish. Beyond the prevailing public discourse and the methodological Zionism in Israeli academia, scholarly accounts of Israel's political regime are less elastic. Often analyzed as an ethnic democracy or ethnocracy on the positive end, or settler colonial or apartheid state on the negative end, Israel is not considered a substantive democracy. In a Jewish state, God, or its Jewish interpreters and followers on earth, are the sovereign. In a democratic state, the citizen is the sovereign, regardless of their ethnic or religious affiliation. Therefore, a state for all its citizens is perceived as an existential threat to Israel, although it is a fundamental character of any democratic state. Hillel Kook, an intellectual and political activist, argued that Israel was, quote, the only theocracy in the world established by secular people. Kook was not a self-hating Jew. He was a prominent leader in the militant Zionist underground, the Etzel, and subsequently a member of Knesset from the Herut party that would later form the ruling Likud party. Israel fits squarely in a region characterized by political regimes based on control of a specific ethnic or religious sect or community over other communities. Lebanon, rather than Israel, is the only exception to this rule. Its consociational political regime is characterized by a unique sectarian power-sharing system that allocates political power among the country's 18 recognized religious sects, ensuring representation in government, the military, and civil service. Lebanon's confessional constitution is distinctive in the region, though it has often led to political paralysis, corruption, and inefficiency. Israel, like other states in the Middle East and beyond, can portray itself as positively as it wishes, but Jews have intrinsic supremacy in its political regime. While Arab and other minorities in Israel may have improved rights and liberties compared to other excluded communities in the region, this fact does not make Israel a substantive democracy. Going back to the chain analogy, you probably belong to the strong link if you believe that Israel is truly democratic. While Israeli Jews would rather believe that their country, note the word their country, is democratic enough, Arab Palestinians experience it as Jewish rather than democratic. For them, Jewish and democratic are not complementary terms, but mutually exclusive terms, and this contradiction is not a bug in the system, but rather a feature of the Jewish nation state. All of the above applies specifically to Israel's sovereign territory within its internationally recognized borders. However, since June 1967, Israel is a country that knows no borders in more than one way. Its occupation of the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza has shaped not only the nature of the conflict with the Palestinians, but Israel's own political landscape and values. In the West Bank, it has established and expanded Jewish settlements inhabited by over 600,000 settlers. These settlements, deemed illegal under international law, have involved land confiscation, home demolitions, and forced evictions. The Oslo Accords divided the West Bank into 3 areas, but Israel retains full control over Area C, which spans 60% of the territory, restricting Palestinian development and movement. Israel continues to execute arbitrary arrests, administrative detentions without trial, and restrictions on movement through checkpoints and barriers throughout the West Bank. In 2005, Israel withdrew its settlers and troops from the Gaza Strip, imposing a blockade over Gaza in 2007 after Hamas took control. The blockade has caused severe humanitarian crisis by restricting access to food, water, medicine, electricity, making the Gaza Strip unlivable by 2020, according to the United Nations. Periodic military operations have resulted in widespread destruction and civilian casualties, culminating in the horrific invasion of Hamas to Israel on October 7, accompanied by heinous war crimes against civilians, and the ensuing destruction of Gaza by Israel, accompanied by mass killings of civilians, war crimes, and ethnic cleansing. Israeli officials, not to mention mainstream media, still rejoice over the Nakba of Gaza. In recent years, consecutive Israeli governments abandoned the framework of the Oslo Accords. While the military security establishment keeps the Palestinian Authority alive as a vital subcontractor of the occupation, it also enables Jewish settler expansionism and violence. At the same time, powerful right-wing politicians insist on toppling the Palestinian Authority altogether. The current Netanyahu regime has adopted a policy of unilateral annexation concerning the West Bank, prioritizing the expansion of Israeli settlements and officially rejecting non-Jewish sovereignty over any territory between the river and the sea. The Israeli strategy is indeed from the river to the sea, but not for thee. One must be a Zionist Israeli Jew to believe that their country, again their country, is essentially democratic, even though it keeps a native people under military occupation with no expiration date, officially and actively rejecting Palestinian nationalism and sovereignty. An opposition leader like Benny Gantz had no discernible disagreement with the Trump administration, as he referred to scattered clusters of Palestinian municipal councils in the West Bank as a Palestinian state, mockingly labeling them even a Palestinian empire. If it were a version of the off-color aristocrat sketch, the punchline would be, we call ourselves a Jewish democracy. A state that refuses consistently to separate itself from religion, excluding a native minority from the nation, denying freedom of a people who not only share this land, but comprised most of the population before the arrival of British colonialism, is a borderless state that calls for a borderless ruler. It sows the seeds of the political nightmare that we currently witness. A manipulative, corrupt, long-standing strongman who leads a judicial coup and straightforward fascism as state institutions gradually collapse in front of him. This, too, is not a random bug, but an essential feature of a political regime that favors ethno-religious supremacy over democratic values. It is no surprise that even government opponents treat the minority as a fifth column instead of co-nationals, a legitimate and even essential opposition force. When we turn to the West Bank and Gaza, the Palestinian reality does not look better. It is true that Israel never allowed for the free development of Palestinian politics and society, and that its expansionist policies and divide and rule strategy are responsible for most of the plight of Palestinians in the occupied territories. However, the Palestinian Authority, like other Arab societies in the Middle East, the Palestinian society, like other Arab societies in the Middle East, is generally conservative, regardless of Israeli intervention. Palestinian intellectuals, commentators, and political activists do not hesitate to criticize their own politics, society, and culture for its corruption, nepotism, and favoritism, and in several cases also for the social, political, and religious extremism and domestic oppression. The rivalry between Fatah and Hamas has been the most prominent feature of Palestinian politics during the last 3 decades, especially after the Hamas takeover of Gaza. While Israel did everything in its power to prevent Palestinian liberation and national reconciliation, the two separate Palestinian governments were far from democratic in their own right. The Palestinian Authority in the West Bank is a corrupt and oppressive regime, much to Israel's joy. The Hamas government in Gaza has been even crueler to its own citizens, transforming over time to a corrupt, extremist, and violent regime. Its brutal invasion of Israel triggered a devastating war that has led to unprecedented death tolls, mass displacement, and widespread destruction in Gaza. Hamas political and military officials knew Israel was led by the most extreme and militant right-wing government in its history, yet they took no precautionary measures to defend their own population before October 7 and totally abandoned them to the mercy of Israel afterwards. By doing so, Hamas completely shattered not only the Gaza Strip and its population, but also its own popularity and legitimacy among the people of Gaza. The deal of the century introduced by the Trump administration in 2020 was followed by the signing of the Abraham Accords later that year, reflecting further erosion of the Palestinian cause. The Oslo model of the two-state solution is no longer relevant, and Jews and Palestinians between the river and the sea are intertwined and therefore interdependent more than ever. The Gaza war, ironically, underscores this reality. Modern-day Israel is not the same country that signed the peace treaties with its Arab neighbors 30 or 40 years ago. Today, ominous populist and authoritarian trends are taking control over Israel. Its alliance with authoritarian powers in the region and beyond is based not only on shared strategic interests, but also on similar worldviews and values. It has adopted regional norms in terms of both regime type and conduct of war. While one cannot predict future development, the consolidation of socio-political processes that draw Israel away from democracies and closer to the region is a plausible scenario. It is time to face reality. Gaza and whoever survives of its population will be in ruins for many years to come. The Palestinians in the West Bank will struggle against both Jewish and Palestinian autocracy and theocracy, and the political regime of Israel will crush dissent forcefully. The Jewish democracy was never immune to autocracy and theocracy and will be less so in the foreseeable future. It will not be able to escape its fate as long as it perceives itself as Jewish rather than Israeli democracy. We stand today at the intersection of fascism in Israel and Jewish supremacy between the river and the sea. The struggles against both are equally important, but the connection between them should not be overlooked. We need to explore this connection at the intellectual and academic level while pushing back against them at the social and political level. However, Jewish Israeli liberals and Arab Palestinian Israelis will not be able to overturn the authoritarian trends on their own. They will need assistance from the outside world, but also from the inside. The insiders are Palestinians who share the desire to be free of oppression and politicized religion, yearning to become members of a state for all its citizens, whether in the framework of two nation state, Palestinian self-rule, a confederation, or one state. Regardless of the political formula, mutual liberation mandates a joint struggle. Our role as Israeli Jews is to stand with Palestinians who are subject to direct or effective control by Israel and protect them as much as we can from Jewish supremacists and militants. However, towards our Jewish Israeli compatriots, we should consider acting as avant-garde rather than radicals, recognizing the need to draw intellectuals, educators, students, public sector employees, and the general public closer to our worldview instead of alienating them. That does not mean blurring our ethical standpoint or political convictions, but rather reaching out to meet people where they are. Our discourse necessitates careful wording and messaging, especially considering the growing authoritarian trends at home and the narrowing space for free speech and dissent. This reality in and of itself is part of reading Israel as a Middle Eastern nation state. It forces us to think and act accordingly in our quest for substantive democracy and equal rights for all between the river and the sea. Thank you very much.
So thank you very much for our presenters, Professor Margolin, Professor Elie Podeh, and Dr. Assaf David. Thank you all for coming, and we will convene for the next panel on 12 o'clock, right? Thank you.